Hi guys, welcome back to another video with me, Christian Koivuma. So in today's video, I'm gonna share 5 things that I wish I would have known when I started out with watercolor. Man, my life would have been so much easier if I had known these things before I started. Okay, let's start with the first one. Number 1, let's start with pigments. So when you start out as a beginner in watercolor, one of the first things that you want to buy is pigments. And it's not very easy considering there are so many different options out there. So these are my favorite watercolor pigments that I use. As you can see, I use watercolor out of a tube, and these are all Winsor & Newton paints. I sometimes use Daniel Smith paints as well. And the paints are yellow ochre, ultramarine, alizarin crimson, sap green, and manganese blue. You're probably wondering, how can you paint paintings with just these paints? Well, the simple answer is that I like mixing paints. I mix paint to get a nice unity in all my paintings. By adding tons of different pigments into the painting, I'm never happy with the end result when I do it that way. Another reason for not using too many different pigments is that every single pigment has its own little personality, you could say. And by using few pigments, you start to learn how they work and what they can do and what they can't do. But if you always keep adding new pigments, and something happens that you didn't expect, then it might be hard to figure out what the core of the problem is. But for me, by now, I know how these work and I know how to use them. And sometimes I add another paint just for the fun of it. Number 2, creating values. So if you have a painting and you don't have too much value changes in your painting, in my opinion, the painting normally looks a little boring, a little flat. And this was something that I was struggling a lot with when I was starting out. I create values in 2 different ways, either by painting washes or different layers of paint on top of each other like this, and letting each layer dry completely before you add the next one. And this will create like a darker value, and eventually you will get a painting with value changes. Another way of creating values in your paintings is by controlling the ratio between water and pigment. And it sounds easy, but it is a little bit tricky. So I'm gonna show you a really simple way of doing this. So here's my best tip on how to create darker values, or making sure that the ratio between pigment and water is really thick. And the easiest way for me probably is straight out of the tube. Squeeze down some paint. There's alizarin crimson. And I'm gonna add some ultramarine blue, like this. And now obviously it's 100% pigment, no water. So we're gonna change that by taking a spray bottle and add a little bit of water. And a little bit of water, that's all it needs to start with. And then I start mixing these 2 pigments with each other. And when you start doing this, the paint will get extremely thick. And that's what you want. You want it to be extremely thick, because you can always add water. But it's harder to go the other way, to feeling stressed while you're painting and realizing that you need a thicker mix of paint. So now it's extremely thick, and if I feel like it's too thick, then I'll just spray and add a little bit more water to it. Man, I wish I would have known this when I started out. That would have made it so much easier for me. Number 3, stretching paper. So when I started out painting, I read in watercolor books or maybe saw videos on YouTube about stretching your paper and how important it is. And today I don't even do it. And there are two different ways that I like to do it, and it's not stretching the paper. So this is the first one. This is a really practical way by using arch watercolor blocks, because the block in itself has glued edges around it. That's a pretty smart way of keeping the paper flattened through the whole painting process. The second way is by buying paper that's a little heavier, just like this one. This one is 640 grams per square meter. And when the paper is heavier, just like this one, it won't buckle as much. And in my opinion, I don't have to stretch it, even though the paper gets really wet. Number 4, brushes. So when you start out, obviously you're gonna need some brushes, and in my opinion, you don't need the most expensive ones when you start out. So this is my cart in my studio, and as you can see, it's pretty bad mess going on here. And in my cart, I have some brushes that are pretty expensive, but I have a lot of cheap brushes in there too. Like these synthetic brushes that I purchased early on. This is among my first brushes, and I would say they're probably one of my favorites still today. Just make sure that you have brushes in different sizes and shapes, because then you have a little bit more options while you're painting. Number 5. When I started out with watercolors and I was reading about how to paint watercolors and trying to find out as much as I possibly could, I realized that there are so many different rules on what you can do and what you're not allowed to do. And when time passed and I painted more and more, I realized that all these rules are just limiting myself. I don't believe in rules. I just believe that any rule is, or any way of doing it is okay as long as you get to where you want to go. So don't get stuck in all these boring rules that watercolor brings. You can do it in any way you want as long as it works for you. So those are my 5 things that I wish I would have known starting out with watercolor. I hope this video will help you so you don't have to do the same mistakes and take the long journey to progress as I had to do. Until I see you next time, bye bye.